Hey guys, and welcome back to the Weeb Army, where we discuss all the weeb shit in the world with a military attitude. So, here is yet another episode of, I'm just gonna call it Breakdown now, because the breakdown is already a thing, unfortunately. So, that's what I'm calling it for now, until I can figure out a better name for it. Which, I mean, if any of you have a better name for it, then by all means, let me know. But this series today is another game series, but it also is an anime series as well. So that does make things a little bit better. This is also one of my favorite series of all time. So today we are going to break down the Neptunia series. Now, this series has gone through a fucking lot of changes throughout the time that it's been around. And that mainly has to do with the fact that when they first made it, they didn't want anyone they didn't want anyone else representing their game console other than themselves. So, you know, that's just how that is. Which is kind of stupid, because they had to completely reboot the series just because of that fact, because they were getting hit with some pretty heavy legal action. Now, obviously, if you've been watching my channel for any amount of time, really, you'll know that I'm a massive fan of the Neptunia series. And of course, I mean, Nepgear is one of my favorite waifus of all time. She's like a top 2, like top 1 or 2 for sure. Now, there are multiple iterations of the Neptunia series. There is all this stuff that isn't canon, which we are not going to really go in depth with today, but I will bring up a little bit of some of the non-canon stuff. As far as the games go now, the new ones that are coming out, there's a lot of spin-off games, and there's a complete reboot of the original series. And the reboot, obviously, is starting with the Hyperdimension Neptunia Rebirth series, trilogy of games, I guess you could call it. So now let's jump into Hyperdimension Neptunia Rebirth 1, which is the first rebooted game in the entire series. The series starts off in the world known as Game Industry. And Game Industry has 4 different countries to it. And each country is run by a CPU, or a goddess, who gets shares to gain their power. And of course, it starts off with, in the middle, essentially, of the console war that's been going on for many, many, many years. It drops you right in the middle of a battle between Purple Heart of Planeptune, Black Heart of Last Station, White Heart of Louis, and Green Heart of Leanbox. Those are all the 4 goddesses with their respective countries. And eventually, throughout the fight, Neptune, also known as Purple Heart, the CPU of Planeptune, gets knocked unconscious. She gets hit really hard and knocked out. And she cannot remember anything. So she doesn't remember anything. She doesn't remember her name. She doesn't remember her friends. She doesn't remember what even the console war is. She doesn't even remember what Planeptune is. So there's really no better way to start off the series, a reboot of the series, than that, because it's kind of a reference to having to completely restart the series. But essentially, you play as Neptune, And of course, Neptune is really the main character of most of these, unless there are some games that don't have Neptune as the main character. So you go around game industry as Neptune, who doesn't remember anything. So then you get introduced to all of her friends. You get introduced to IF. You get introduced to Compa. And more importantly, you get introduced to all the other CPUs, all the other goddesses within the series. And in a lot of ways, it actually leads on to the series becoming the way it is, which it started to lean towards all the CPUs working together to fight a greater evil. Now, the main villain of the series is R4, who she's kind of a stereotypical villain. She essentially just wants to take over a game industry and basically become the only CPU around, which is obviously a very common villain trope. But a lot of iterations of the series, her character can get kind of confusing sometimes, because sometimes, depending on what part of the series you're watching, she can be seen as extremely incompetent or just downright stupid. But other times, she is genuinely devious and intelligent, and she actually is a genuine threat to the CPUs and to their respective countries. I think the best iteration of R4 that I've seen so far, the most intimidating version of her was in Mega Dimension Neptunia V2. She definitely was a far more intimidating character in that game than in pretty much any of the other Hyperdimension Neptunia games or anime or anything like that. Now, the series also goes into the next game, which is Hyperdimension Neptunia Rebirth 2, Sister Generation, and it essentially just goes into the CPU candidates, also known as the CPU's sisters. And that is where Nepgear comes in. So with Rebirth 2, you get introduced to the sisters, the CPU candidates. So in Rebirth 2, you get introduced to the CPU candidates, which are Nepgear, Uni, Rom, and Ram. That's it, because Vert doesn't have any sisters, at least in this game. And now the story goes through as you're playing as Nepgear, really as the main character for the most part, and R4 actually captures the CPUs and essentially is killing them. And so it's up to the CPU candidates to actually be able to defeat her and save their sisters. And throughout the story, they can't go HDD, which is their CPU or goddess mode, I guess you could call it. And so they spend a lot of the game trying to figure out how to do it in order to be able to defeat R4. And eventually, obviously, they do figure out how to do it. Every single one of the CPU candidates had learned that the reason why they can't go HDD is because they put a limit around themselves in some form or in some way. Like, for instance, Nepgear, she couldn't go HDD because she was afraid of becoming more powerful than her sister, Neptune. She was genuinely afraid of it, but then once she accepted the possibility of becoming stronger than her sister, which she actually does, she actually unlocks her ability to go HDD, and then all the other girls follow suit and are able to defeat R4 and then save their sisters. Now after Rebirth 2, it goes into Rebirth 3, where Neptune is the main character again. So you're playing as Neptune in Rebirth 3, but you are sent to another dimension, and this dimension with Planet Neptune, there is one CPU of Planet Neptune, and it's not Neptune, it is actually a girl named Plutia. And from there, you are introduced to a bunch of different characters that were kind of in the main series, kind of not. Like, everything is slightly different. The biggest difference between Rebirth 3 and Rebirth 1 really is the fact that Plutia is the CPU of Planet Neptune and not Neptune. Now, I can also dive a little bit into Mega Dimension Neptunia V2, which has similar concepts to Rebirth 3, which Neptune, as the main character, is alongside Nepgear, and they are sent to another dimension. But instead of this being only a slight difference, this is a major difference, because the entirety of game industry has fallen into ruin. It's been completely destroyed, and you meet a girl who is a CPU named Uzume, or Orange Heart. Now, Uzume is really the only CPU left in this world, until, obviously, Neptune and Nepgear show up. Now, this situation is very similar to Rebirth 3, where Neptune and Nepgear can't either. Neither of them can go HDD without share crystals. They need the share crystals. They cannot, because they are not the CPUs of that particular country that they're in, or even that dimension or that world or anything. They can only go HDD is if they get a physical share crystal, and then they obviously consume that share crystal to go HDD, and then from there they can kick ass and do whatever they need to do. But that makes this game far more difficult as well, because the only character that can actually go HDD for like almost half of the game, I would say, is Uzume. Now, once Neptune and Nepgear kind of figure out exactly how to go HDD, they don't take too long with doing that. They're usually pretty solid about it. And then, of course, there's the whole situation where Neptune jumps into the portal, and Nepgear doesn't jump into the portal because she wants to stay back and help Uzume with whatever the threat is that's there. Now, something that a lot of people don't really know and or can't really understand about the Neptunia series in general is the fact that Nepgear really is like the strongest of the CPUs and or CPU candidates. She, now in Hyperdimension Neptunia MK2, there's a little thing called the Conquest ending, which is something I know a lot of people are going to be pained about me bringing up, but unfortunately that's just a part of the series now, isn't it? And now in that ending, Nepgear is able to defeat every single one of the goddesses. Now, when it came to Neptune, she didn't want to kill Neptune. She obviously didn't want to kill Neptune because she was afraid of losing her sister. She was afraid of killing her sister. And then, obviously, towards the end of the Conquest ending, Nepgear realizes she's all alone in the world and she's the lone CPU, which exactly is what the Conquest ending was about, was Nepgear defeating all the other CPUs to become the sole CPU of game industry. So that is essentially saying that Nepgear is the strongest CPU. And of course, a lot of people will argue with me about that. A lot of people are like, oh, well, actually, Neptune is the strongest. But, I mean, there is really no evidence. And, of course, there's a ton of evidence to suggest that Nepgear is extremely OP. Even in the games, in the anime, everything. She just kicks ass as soon as she powers up and she's just fucking ready to go. I can't explain why exactly they did that to her or for her, but that's just how it is. Now, that's a general summary of what the series is about, stuff like that. Now, when I say it's difficult to get into the series, no. This series is not difficult to get into. The most difficult part of the series, I think, would probably be just the fact that it gets kind of childish sometimes, because Neptune essentially acts like a child, okay? You're gonna kind of have to get over that fact, but Neptune is also hilarious, so it doesn't really fucking matter. Now, would it be difficult to understand this series? No. I would not consider this series to be difficult. I would consider this series to be a more unconventional series. I would consider it to be a series that is just, as far as being difficult, it is certainly slightly above average, but it is really not that difficult. It is not nearly as close to like the Fate series, is not nearly as close to even like Attack on Titan. I would say the lore behind the Neptunia series goes maybe only slightly deeper than like Sword Art Online. But unlike Sword Art Online, the story with the Neptunia series is generally quite good. But anyways, that's gonna do it for this video. I hope you enjoy this series as well, because I'm having fun with this series, talking to you guys about anime that may be more unconventional. So anyways, thank you all so much for watching this video. If you liked it, why not share with your friends, your family, or whoever else you want, and I will see all you magnificent bastards in the next video.